Prokaryotes are extremely important in the biosphere and in ecosystems and for all life on the planet. As I mentioned previously, they set up the system that we all live within. And that pretty much started all at the very beginning when prokaryotes first evolved about 4 billion years ago. It wasn't long, well, relatively, before prokaryotes came to be able to photosynthesize. And they are producers, right? Photosynthetic organisms are producers. They can be eaten by others. And those prokaryotes, those first prokaryotes that could photosynthesize, they were similar to the cyanobacteria that we have alive today. And cyanobacteria serve as food, as do other prokaryotes, non-photosynthetic prokaryotes or heterotrophic prokaryotes. They're very low on the food chain, and they serve as a food source for a lot of different organisms. They also, being photosynthetic, produce oxygen. And again, the very first photosynthetic bacteria, cyanobacteria, like bacteria that first evolved, are the ones that caused oxygen to build up and eventually build up in the atmosphere, making it possible for multicellular life to evolve. So, hugely important. Also, they serve as mutualistic and parasitic symbionts within other living things, within or on other living things. So, for example, you have many mutualistic symbiotic bacteria that live on and in your body, and you can't live without them. If you were to completely sterilize yourself, you would have a very hard time living. You would have to be kept alive if it was even possible to keep you alive. And that's your microbiome. And every single living species on this planet has a microbiome, has bacteria, has prokaryotes that live with them symbiotically. So that's a hugely important function for prokaryotes. Also, and this is probably a function of prokaryotes that you've heard about before, every living thing eventually dies and decomposes. And it's the bacteria, the prokaryotes, along with fungi, that are the true decomposers, that finally break down the very last bits and pieces of once living organisms into their molecular components. And that's what decomposition really is. Breaking down tissues and organs, flesh and bone, into molecules. And along with that function comes the return of those molecules, the return of those nutrients back to the biosphere, back to ecosystems. And so they are involved heavily in nutrient cycling. And one of the nutrient cycles they are most heavily involved in is the nitrogen cycle, which we'll see on the next slide. So this diagram shows the nitrogen cycle, and it is one of, if not the most complex biogeochemical cycle that we're going to be learning about this year. And I'm not expecting you to know all the details, especially at this point, because we're going to study biogeochemical cycles in another unit. But I just want you to understand how heavily involved bacteria are, prokaryotes are, in keeping this nitrogen cycle running. And what's so important about nitrogen? Well, it makes up nucleic acids and proteins. If you'll recall, nucleic acids have these things called nitrogenous bases or nitrogen bases. And they call them nitrogen bases because they contain a lot of nitrogen. Proteins are made up of amino acids. The amino groups of amino acids contain nitrogen. So nitrogen is really important for every living thing on the planet. The Earth's atmosphere is about 78% nitrogen. So, the air around you right now is mostly nitrogen, but your body can't take that nitrogen and use it to make nucleic acids and proteins. Plants can't take it from the air and use it to make nucleic acids and proteins. The only thing that can take the nitrogen out of the air and fix it, as we say, make it into a form that living things can use, are bacteria, are prokaryotes. And right here is where it begins in the diagram. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the root nodules of legumes. This is an example of the roots of a legume, and you can see these little brown nodules, and the plant produces these for the bacteria to live inside. It's a symbiotic relationship. The bacteria, the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, are mutualistic symbionts of the plant, and they take the nitrogen from the air and turn it into a form that the plant can use. In other words, fertilizer. If you look on any bag of fertilizer, you're going to see nitrogen listed as one of the ingredients. And that's because nitrogen is a limiting factor for plants. It's a limiting nutrient. Plants can only grow if they have a sufficient supply of nitrogen. There are also nitrogen-fixing soil bacteria, and they're doing the same thing, taking nitrogen gas from the air and turning it into a form that plants can use. So nitrogen fixation is the process of transforming inorganic nitrogen, like nitrogen gas from the air, into a form photoautotrophs can use, like plants and even cyanobacteria. And as I already explained, legumes are beans, peas, peanuts, etc. that have a mutualistic symbiotic relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live in root nodules, nodules like these on their roots. And there's one more step in getting the nitrogen-containing compounds, like ammonium here, into a form that plants can use, and that is called nitrification. So, and that is also involving bacteria, prokaryotes. So again, they're heavily involved in transforming nitrogen into a form that plants can use. In other words, fertilizing the plants. So nitrification is done by nitrifying bacteria. So we have nitrogen-fixing bacteria, we have nitrifying bacteria, and that's how nitrogen gets into a form that plants are able to use. Notice too on the diagram that there are these bacteria that are known as denitrifying bacteria, and they're actually taking these nitrogen compounds and taking the nitrogen and putting it back in the air, turning it back into nitrogen gas and releasing it back into the atmosphere. So bacteria, prokaryotes, are heavily involved in the nitrogen cycle to get that nitrogen eventually incorporated into organic compounds, and that's what plants do with it. You know, this nitrogen in the diagram here, NO3, NO2, notice there's no carbon there. It's NH4, the ammonium ion. None of them contain carbon, so they are non-organic. It's the plants that take these compounds and incorporate them into nucleic acids and proteins, and that's when they become organic compounds. Because nucleotides and amino acids also contain carbon. That's what an organic compound is. In addition to keeping every single living thing alive on the planet, there are other uses for bacteria for us. One is in food production. So yogurt, cheese, wine relies on prokaryotes. Mutualistic endosymbiont prokaryotes make up your microbiome, help you digest your food, produce vitamins for you. We use prokaryotes to mine certain minerals, known as biomining. I'm not that familiar with those processes, but I know it exists. And we use prokaryotes to purify water. So, for example, in this coagulation, sedimentation, filtration process, there are bacteria, prokaryotes, that are in that part of the system that are helping to purify the water. And then the water's disinfected to remove those prokaryotes before arriving at your house. And we use prokaryotes in genetic engineering to produce human proteins for medication. That's what this diagram is showing. This is a biotechnology that has been developed to take advantage of prokaryotes' ability to take in genes and then express those genes. So we can take a human gene, in this case the one for insulin, cut it out of the human chromosome, put it into a bacterial plasmid, put that plasmid back into a bacterial cell, and that bacterium will multiply, for one thing, and it'll pass on that human gene to all its offspring. But it and all its offspring then will express that gene and make insulin for us. And we can do that with any human protein that we want to. So it's fantastic. Prokaryotes are incredibly diverse, an incredibly diverse group. There are species, probably millions of species, that we have not even discovered yet. So we have no idea just how many prokaryotes there are on the planet. However, there are clues to species that we haven't found yet, and that's their DNA. The DNA of prokaryotes can be in the environment and can be identified without even finding the actual cells themselves, the actual prokaryotes themselves. We know they're out there because their DNA is in the environment. We can sequence their DNA and see that they are different species. But anyway, what this is a phylogenetic tree which shows the evolutionary relationships between these groups of prokaryotes. And this is only 7 phyla of prokaryotes out of 20 that are currently recognized and have currently been classified. And these 7 are in the diagram because they are pathogens. Pathogens meaning they cause disease. There are definitely other groups of prokaryotes that are important, for example, in supporting the entire biosphere, one of them being the phylum Cyanophyta, which is the phylum that includes cyanobacteria, those photosynthetic prokaryotes that add oxygen to the atmosphere, for example, and serve as food for other organisms. Pathogenic prokaryotes, like the ones that we see here, and if you look through the lists here, you'll probably run across some that are familiar to you. They cause disease by damaging cells. You know, when they infect you, they multiply in your body, and they can directly damage cells in the process. They can also release toxins. And there are 2 different kinds of toxins, endotoxins and exotoxins that we'll be identifying and looking at on another slide. But those toxins in general, interfere with normal metabolic function. So on the next slide, we'll be looking at a list of some common bacterial diseases, diseases caused by pathogenic prokaryotes.